We hope to achieve this by learning from each other, sharing information and data, identifying gaps and problems, solving collectively to reduce and prevent chemical poisonings and environmental contamination, really with a view to a toxic-free future for the next generation. And this chemicals network is hosted by the Division of Environmental Health here at the University of Cape Town, but it is supported by generous funding from Sweden through the Swedish Chemicals Agency, Chemi. We have three presenters today. I'll do a very quick introduction. As I mentioned, this is not a webinar. It's really what we want to do is engage with you. And we have different ways for you to engage with us. We will not enable anyone's mic except the presenters. The presenters will keep their mics on and their videos on and will engage with you. We ask you to post any questions or comments or concerns in the chat. And also there'll be polls like the one you saw earlier as you joined, and we ask that you engage with those. This is a nonpartisan group, which means we may not agree with each other, but we will respect each other's point of view. And when you comment in the group, we already have 42 people on, so that we're going to be a big group today. Please do mention your country or your organization because it helps the presenters. So with no further ado, I will move on to introducing you to today's discussion. We will have three esteemed speakers. Ule Johanssen has been with us many times, and we really appreciate, Ule, that you've joined us again from the Swedish Chemicals Agency, Chemi. We will also have Annika Hilgert from the Stockholm Environment Institute, and Rico Euripidou from groundWork, who's also no stranger to the discussion network as well. So thank you to all three of you for taking time. As you know, next slide, please. We've developed a policy brief on sustainable financing. And as I said, that what we talk about, and if you can, I know it's small, we're encouraging you to please download the policy brief. It will also be put in the chat now, the link for you to be able to download it. And because, as you can see, key to chemicals and waste management is legislation. Countries need to have sound legislation. But in order to implement the legislation, in order to enforce the legislation, there's this need for sustainable financing. So we've put this policy brief together with the support of many people who are even on this call. And the idea is to really be able to provide some support for low and middle income countries to look at one of the pillars of financing. So UNEP talks about the three pillars, so industry being involved with financing, having external financing, but then also having this domestic financing, which I think is often very challenging for low and middle income countries. Next slide, please. And so in the policy brief, we talk about, well, what should actually be covered by national financing? What are the elements sort of that governments should be thinking about? So gathering data on health and environmental hazards, or disseminating information about these hazards, or providing a structure for the value chain from production to waste, and research on health impacts, standardizing, training, and awareness raising, and establishing multi-stakeholder committees, which Rico is going to talk to us about later. But in looking at what should be covered, it's also saying, well, is it all the government's responsibility? And so if you can make this bigger on your screen if you haven't worked it out yet, but if you remove the participants on the right-hand side, the picture of all of us, you can enlarge and you should be able to read the text. So you can see from table 1, we talk about looking at national government's responsibilities for financing versus industry. And I think this is very important because often governments in low and middle income countries tend to shoulder most of the finances or the financing of chemicals and waste management, which you won't actually see being done in places like the EU or the US or Canada, for example. So it's looking at the responsibilities of the government for developing, issuing, and updating legislation, enforcing legislation, the general administration, and establishing and maintaining government structures. Whereas industry's responsibility is to provide transparent information and access to this information and financing that. Classifying and labeling of chemicals, gathering data, updating information, coming up with non-toxic alternatives, reporting on legislated obligation, and developing waste handling strategies, for example. We go on to the next slide. What we've done then in this policy brief is said, well, how then can countries, how can low and middle income countries come up with different financing approaches to actually bring in the money that governments need for chemicals and waste management? And I am simplifying things, so I'm hoping that you will download the brief so that we can move on into the discussion. But some of the models are tax-based, fee-based, national budget allocation, looking at extended producer responsibility programs, which I hope we'll touch on a bit more. And if you have questions about those, please do put them in the chat. Looking at incentives for industry, like tax rebates, and then also looking for penalties that are at a reasonable level, which at the moment they're not in many of our countries in the middle income.
Andrea, sorry, I think we've lost your sound. Ah, okay, you're back.
Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide? Can you hear me?
It's a little patchy, but we can hear you. Can you say something again?
Natalia.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I think there's a sound issue. Andrea will be back in a moment. Hi, sorry about that. Andrea's just had an internet connectivity issue, but that's all right. In the meantime, we can get started with our first presenter, who is Ule Johanssen. He is, as Andrea mentioned, from the Swedish Chemicals Agency, or Chemi, as it's known. Ule, welcome on board, and you may begin.
Oh, thank you, everyone. Good to be here again in this forum. My name is Ule Johanssen. I work at the Swedish Chemical Agency with development cooperation issues since a very long time. A few days ago, I just fell and broke my arm, so I now have it in a cast. And then one can wonder, how was my hospital care paid for? I had only to pay a very small fee of $20, but the cost was, of course, much higher to treat my injury. And this is a way I think we can move into the issue of financing. And maybe I can have the next slide, please. All the services that we as a government provide, of course, have to be financed in some way. And I can tell you, any government, there is always a complaint that there is not enough financing for what we want to do. And of course, this can mean a lot of different things. Cash is one thing, but often we mean that we can't have enough staff. We can't get the tools that we need for inspection, analyze samples, etc. And then we can handle these issues, of course, if we have sufficient long-term funding. We have described this in a guidance document that is available on our web, that you can take a look at if you haven't already. But I'd like to discuss some very important or key terms in this context. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Who should do the job? I think this is very much a very important question. What kind of responsibility should we take on? The more we do, the more funds we need. But do we need to take on all the responsibility? And a simple example is risk assessment. Should the producer of a chemical product or the government do the risk assessment? If we think that we need to do it in the government, this also, of course, leads to a need for a lot of funding. But if we think the private sector should do it, then of course the government does not need those funds. So the dividing line by responsibility is very important to discuss, because it will affect the need for funds and resources. Also chemicals, it's broadly spoken about. Which chemicals do we want to cover with this? Only the most hazardous ones, mildly hazardous, or maybe all of them? I will return to this issue again when I talk about the Swedish example later. Waste. This is about chemicals and waste. It was in one way a bit simpler before, because we usually didn't have the circular thinking, but now we do. And this means that what used to many times be treated as waste now becomes a new resource and maybe a new chemical. And then definitions of what is waste and what is chemicals is also very important. Sustainable is also one of those words that we see flying around everywhere. But what do we mean with that? Is it that we have funds for this year? Is it that we have funds from several sources, resources from several sources? Is this always cash, or is it making knowledge available, experts available? Maybe we should think, not limit ourselves to look at it as only cash. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, usually when we discuss financing, this is divided in at least 3 different groups, and we talk about taxes, which is typically what any government collect and bring into the state treasury, you could say, and then disperse it according to the existing policies and politics. Fees is a bit different. They're generally collected for a specific purpose from a specific subject. And in our case, very often it's a chemical industry or a chemical importer, someone handling chemicals that has to pay a fee that we decide. A third source is external funding, often mentioned as donors or global facilities that provide funds for specific purposes. Usually these are limited to a specific subject and a specific timing. And we can really discuss if this is sustainable or not. So next slide, please. Before we move to the question, I would just like to share our own example, one example from Sweden. As you heard, I am at the Swedish Chemicals Agency, government agency under the used to be the Ministry of Environment, but now it's a new ministry. This agency was created to have a new way of handling chemical issues in the Swedish government. And when Chemi was created, it was also decided that most of the funding of the chemical agency should be paid by fees. A system of chemical fees was established. It was based on annual production or importation of chemicals listing according to specific custom codes, and the fees is paid annually. Here is, you can ask several questions. What chemicals are we talking about? It was decided from the Swedish government that we should, all chemicals, no matter how hazardous or little hazardous they had hazards, they should pay a fee. You could say it was a system built on kind of a solidarity that anyone handling any chemicals should contribute to this work. Because in the end, it can always change what is health or environmentally hazardous or not. And I can tell you the private sector intensively protested this whole setup. It said it was too expensive, it would drive away chemical industry and chemical handlers from Sweden, and they should not have to pay this. The government persisted, and this whole system was set up. And it has actually been running since then. And today, these fees pay for about 50% of the cost of running Chemi. The other 50% is paid from the state treasury. You could say taxes. Sometimes we also get funds for doing specific projects from approving or working with EU systems, but mostly Chemi is funded by fees or taxes. And yeah, this was just to give you a Swedish example. And then from there, I'd like to move to the first question then. So what is the main purpose of this sustainable financing of chemicals and waste management? Why would we like to have this sustainable financing? Not just financing, but that it is sustainable. So please elaborate on this issue about sustainable financing from your point of view. Natasha, I don't know. Do you?
Thank you, Ule. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you, Andrea. Glad to see you again.
Oh, goodness, sorry. And the internet dropped.
Yes.
Sorry, but thank you for continuing, and thank you for the really taking us through to this discussion. But ending with this Swedish example, I think that's really important for people to think about. So I'm going to ask people to answer the question that Ule has posed to you in the chat. And Ule, you can leave your mic and video on and respond to people as they come through. You can see that some comments are being posted in the chat. You are welcome to post comments as well as questions. So back to you, Ule, thanks.
I'm not so quick today because I only have my left hand.
Yes, I'm sorry to hear about that.
but I'll do my best.
We will field questions for you.
Thank you.
So there's more of a comment at the moment from Young Chakana from Malawi about the importance of sustainable financing, but really unpacking what does sustainable mean. So maybe Jan, this was posted on his behalf, but it would be good if others and maybe other students who are joining to really unpack this concept of sustainable. I think while people are posting, we can, in the meantime, perhaps go to our first poll. So while you're thinking about unpacking the concept of sustainable, what are the minimum government services connected to chemicals waste management that need to be funded? And if you go to the link in the chat on Tomenti.com, you'll be able to post your response. Thank you. So Ule, there is a comment from Derek Masako about sustainable financing. The comments are now coming through.
Yeah, I see.
Okay.
It's interesting. The comments is a lot about management, and this is also always brings up the question: what kind of management? I guess the writers mean the government part of the management.
So there are
brought up here about
good.
environmental sound practices is also an important question. Who should fund or work with developing new practices or less hazardous chemicals, and should this be funded this way? we have experts coming to Kemi, and we have trainings, we talk about the responsibilities and who should do what, and financing. In the end, I mean, all this work is financed, you could say, by industry, either by them paying taxes or fees, or, I mean, the government rarely have any resources by themselves. So approaching the industry or anyone handling chemicals is necessary, and also decide what their contribution should be.
I'm not sure, Ule, if you can also see the comments coming in from the poll that are on the screen.
Now I'm just looking at the chat.
Okay.
Okay, I'll make the chat a bit smaller. So.
I'll keep an eye on the chat if there's any questions for you. But in the meantime, you can have a look at the comments people have put out. What are the minimum government services connected to chemicals and waste management that need to be funded? And there's quite a list coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really think this is very important. It's kind of tempting from a government perspective that to do all of it. I mean, to have knowledge about all the chemicals, risk assess all of them, decide on risk reduction measures, and so on. But it easily becomes an impossible task, and impossible to have funds for it. So I think once you've listed, like you do now, here in the Menti, a lot of tasks that should be on the authority, you always need to think if you want to have that responsibility.
I think that's probably a challenge. It's easy for governments to come up with this shopping list of all the areas that need to be covered, and then to take on those costs themselves. And that's, what we were referring to in the beginning with the policy brief that we all developed together, that really learning how to divide these responsibilities. And then this concept of sustainability. I mean, when you look at the example that you gave from Kemi, that it's still many, many, many years down the road, still working, that it's still getting 50% of its income from taxes. It's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I can only second that. If the government can provide, you should say, a long-term and safe post for you, then people will invest in their career and life in the government, and it will be a win-win, I would say.
That's actually a very good point, because at least in South Africa, we have a huge attrition of government employees going into industry. So yeah, it's a very good point.
Yeah, you have to be able to compete, maybe not always with the top salaries, but with a long-term employment. I think that will be good enough for a lot of us.
So we have one more poll. I realize we're going to move on to the next question soon. So who should be responsible for domestic financing of chemicals and waste? Again, you just click on the link in the chat and you'll be able to choose more than one if you like. And in the meantime, while people are doing this, I'm not sure, Ule, if you'd like to make any summary statements for question one.
I always kind of tend to go back to the responsibility. this issue of what responsibility do you want to have inside the government, in academia, in the industry? It's like it has to be really the starting point. Then you can discuss what kind of resources you need for that. That would be really my top priority.
Unfortunately, it seems like you can't do multiple choices. So it seems like the bulk is going to the industry. Although I think some of the responsibility perhaps should be shared, but one can't choose multiple.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Ule. Thank you again for coming and joining us and sharing your thoughts about sustainable domestic financing, which is so important. And we have referred in the guidance, in the document, to the ChemE documents as well, which is important for people to look into about financing plans. And we wish you a speedy recovery with your arm, your wrist, and please do stay on for, if you can.
Yes, I will. Just to mention, I know that there are, UNITAR is also providing some short courses and on financing issues, and so there are more places to go.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, now. Not.
Okay, sorry.
It's a bit lagging. You freeze sometimes.
So we're going to move on to the next speaker. I'm sorry, I keep coming in and out of the internet. So Annika, I invite you, my apologies. I'm going to quickly hand over to you before I drop off again. So I'll ask you to please introduce yourself, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. My name's Annika Hilgert. I am a research associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute in Sweden, where I work broadly on development policy and finance. And today I just wanted to give you a little introduction on the work that we have recently been doing on domestic financing for chemicals and waste management. So if we could please go to the next slide to get started. Yes, exactly. So the overarching question that I'm going to be looking at, and Ule really set me up for success here, is how national institutions and agencies responsible for overseeing and managing chemicals and wastes can be sustainably financed, which has been the focus of a recent research project we've been doing here at SEI. So I'm hoping to get a little bit more technical and sort of take as my point of departure that we have this need for a dedicated government agency for chemicals and waste management. Those are the kind of government responsibilities that Professor Andrea Rotho was referring to in the UCT policy brief. And then with that come these key tasks that these government agencies have. And our question really is, okay, how can these tasks be sustainably financed in the long term? Especially there's often reliance on donor funding, and how can we transition out of that? How can capacity that's built in these agencies, in these institutions, be domestically financed in the long term? So instead of running through the different models for national financing that are sort of in the policy brief, I wanted to broaden out a little bit and briefly discuss two case studies that we looked at as part of our research, which are two different financing mechanisms from other sort of broadly environmental areas, mainly biodiversity protection, and see how they may be applicable to the chemicals context and how we can finance national institutions and agencies for chemicals management. So if we could go to the next slide, please, and we will dive right into, our first case study. Due to the time constraints, I'm going to run through these quite quickly, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the discussion section. But one of the financing mechanisms we looked at is called payments for ecosystem services, which is currently, for example, implemented in Vietnam. Ecosystem services are essentially benefits that humans derive from the natural environment. And this payment system for ecosystem services then sort of aims to charge users of ecosystems for using them. And the revenues of that are then usually allocated to sort of maintain and protect relevant ecosystems. And I've put here on the right-hand side just a little diagram to show you what kind of services ecosystems can provide. So in Vietnam, there's this payment for forest service system, which regulates 5 environmental services provided by forest areas, which are listed here, but really it can be applied to any ecosystem that provides any of the services listed on the right. If we could go to the next slide, please. Then we can dig into a little bit more of, how this works in practice and a little bit more technically. Okay, how does this financing system actually work? So as you see in the diagram on the right, you at the top have the ecosystem service providers, which in our case, in the Vietnam case study, are forest owners, management boards of protected forests, individuals holding forest land titles. So anyone who's sort of like taking care or owning part of a forest. And then at the bottom, we've got the ecosystem service users, which in this case are hydropower enterprises, water supply companies, ecotourism businesses. And then here in the middle in red, you've got the government, which sort of implements this financing system, usually in a similar way to a tax, and sort of provides these laws and regulations to charge the users of ecosystems for this use. And there's different prices that get put on ecosystem services, and it varies depending on what the buyer uses. So for hydropower enterprises, for example, it's a certain price per kilowatt hour of electricity. And what we were really interested in is sort of, okay, well, what happens with the revenue from this? And in this situation, it goes to the Vietnam Forest Development and Protection Fund, which in the diagram is on the left-hand side in yellow. It would be the intermediary. And 90% of the payments are passed on to the providers of forest ecosystem services, and they're sort of there to finance the protection and maintenance. But what we were really interested in is that 10% of these payments are passed on, are earmarked for fund administration and operation. And that's sort of the kind of oversight activity, the kind of management activity that is less to do with sort of operationally protecting the forest, but yeah, this kind of like oversight and management activity, how that is financed. And so we were really interested in, how we can maybe apply this to a chemicals context. Like, is this a way that a chemicals agency or government organization that is in charge of it with oversight could be financed, maybe linked to sort of like the environment ministry, perhaps? And of course, this is sort of very dependent on what ecosystems are available in a given country, and sort of like making a clear link between protecting and maintaining an ecosystem and sort of like chemicals management. But there are obviously some examples for this. So if we think about water-related ecosystems, we could maybe identify chemicals companies as buyers of ecosystem services in terms of using clean water, or using sort of nutrient cycling land services that the ecosystem provides. And in this way, if we identify the chemicals industry as a relevant buyer of ecosystem services, we can operationalize the polluter pays principle, and which is considered sort of fair. And it has this additional benefit as well, because it mainstreams chemicals and waste management alongside sort of other environmental considerations and issues in this joint system. So this is one of the examples we looked at for saying, okay, yeah, maybe we could apply a similar system to this. with these revenues being collected, most of it going to the operational costs, and then some of it going to the sort of like management oversight financing, which is what we're really interested in. So I'd be super interested to hear people's reflections on this example in the comments. And if we could go to the next slide, please, I will just briefly discuss a second case study from our research, which is a bit closer to the chemicals context and similar a little bit to what Ule was saying. But what's interesting again is sort of like how the revenues are used and how part of them can be allocated to financing these national institutions that are charged with oversight. So we're going to talk a little bit about import licenses for pesticides in Kenya. Import licenses essentially provide producers the right to import and place chemicals on the domestic market. They're applied for in advance and then usually enforced at the border. And Kenya has imposed fees for import licenses for a range of different pesticides. And this has increased to 1.4% of the import value in 2022 and is expected to raise sort of like additional revenue. And what's really interesting here is what happens with the revenue, and that's what's in this diagram on the right here, this little figure. So 50% of revenues are allocated to the Agrochemicals Association of Kenya for product stewardship and training, and that's more to do with the management of chemicals itself, quite practically. And then we've got the other 50%, which is what, again, we were really after, is that they're allocated to the Pest Controls Board, Product Board, to maintain the pesticides register and conduct inspection services. And that's exactly, the kind of thing we were interested in, how funding can be allocated to these oversight and management costs, which is really what we were looking for. And very important, I think also something that came out of Ule's introduction is that this process worked partly because there was quite intense involvement of industry stakeholders that needed to be consulted and involved to generate buy-in and acceptance through different meetings and different ways of them being able to raise concerns. So that's very interesting. If we could go to the next slide, please. But of course, it's not without its challenges. There were obviously different concerns associated with imposing and raising this level of fees here. But what we are really interested in is of the benefits that, there's this increased financial resources and training, and that'll lead to more efficient and effective pest management, and really provides secure and sustainable funding for this sort of like managerial side of things. And again, we've thought this was an interesting example of how revenues can be allocated to government agency funding, and whether this can be applied to other chemical products or products containing chemicals, or if this is applicable to existing fee systems, that the revenues can be split this way. So again, would be very interested to hear reflections on this. If anyone has experience with using these kinds of systems, would be super interested to hear. And then very briefly, we can go to the final slide, which summarizes some of the more general conclusions that we had from this research project that we were doing. And I won't go through all of them, but something to stress here is that one of the conditions for even establishing these financing mechanisms that we found is that you need this sort of minimal level of financial resources from the national budget. And as Ule rightly said, those don't come from nowhere, right? That money has been raised through other ways, which I guess then more raises a question about how those taxes were raised or how this money was raised, and how that should then be allocated in response. But we didn't come across any cases where cost recovery for these oversight activities was 100%. As Ule said in his example of Kemi does really well on cost recovery and still sort of like only recovers 50% of its running costs. And there's different reasons for that, partly because there might be situations where full cost recovery is not considered appropriate, where it might put an undue burden on industry, especially on small producers, or if you want to encourage the use of certain products over others. So you might adjust how expensive applications are for products that you want more of. And there are situations where it's simply not possible, you know, where industry won't cooperate, where there's limited ability to enforce, where governments face costs for management of waste that has been sort of like abandoned or not legally imported nor produced, things like orphan waste, for example. Yeah, so that's something I think important to keep in mind, that while shifting costs to the industry is, I think, absolutely important, there's limits to the extent to which that often happens in practice. Cool. Thank you so much. Those were all my slides, so I think we can go to the next, or the first question rather. Yeah, would be very interested to hear people's thoughts, experiences. I'll have a peek in the chat now if anyone said anything.
Thank you very much, Annika. It's really important to have these examples, because it's one thing to talk about sustainable financing, but then to actually get into the technical aspect of what it would look like. So the question is, how can national institutions and agencies responsible for overseeing and management chemicals and waste be sustainably financed? So I'll let you look at some of the comments and questions, and I please remind the members who are joining us today that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Because of time, we only allow the presenters to speak.
Yeah, some very interesting comments in the chat. Glad to see that people are positive towards the payments for ecosystem services system, and sort of like comparing it to the AI's clearing programs. Very relevant. Yeah, I mean, this is a good question about sort of like best practices for law enforcement and regulations, which I think is maybe a bit bigger than chemicals management as such. But yeah, I think resistance and corruption is obviously key for all of these mechanisms to recover costs from the industry in particular. So something that we looked at in our research project was to really encourage governments to, if they can, rely on systems that already work. So if they already have strong capacity in a certain area, like if they already have strong border control capacities, to then maybe use the financing mechanisms that make use of that, like import fees. And if they have strong sort of like capacities in other areas, like tax collection, for example, then maybe taxes are more appropriate for the moment. Yeah, I think there was also, extended producer responsibility systems come up, very interesting. Also, interesting with those, to what extent they can sort of like finance government agencies and institutions, because a lot of the time in the producer fees that producers will pay, there is not any funding that is earmarked towards a government agency for oversight, which would, for example, finance like inspection or supervision, or generally the resources that are required to like implement regulations related to the EPR itself. So that's an interesting area for development. Very good also to see people raising like ring fencing and earmarking. That's super important, that resources that are raised, revenues, are actually allocated then to chemicals management and not used for other areas.
Just to remind people while you're looking at the comments, the many comments coming through, that there is a poll question as well. And again, you just click on the Menti link that is in the chat, and you can respond to the question on the screen. Back to you, Annika.
Yeah, lots of very interesting comments coming in. I think, yeah, good to see budget allocation as well. Coming through, that's something we still need to keep in mind. And very interesting, I keep seeing penalties raised, and then there's a very good question here from Blessings Melima about penalties being sustainable. We, in our research project, looked at this and sort of like didn't consider them as sustainable an option, partly because the funding streams for those can be very volatile, because it really depends on, how many people are breaking rules for you to be able to collect those penalties. So it's really volatile, and because the intention behind them is not usually explicitly to raise funding. So they're usually not explicitly aimed at that. So we didn't strongly focus on them, but it's a conversation to be had for sure. All right, I'm just going to look at some of the things that are coming up on the screen, because I'm really super interested to learn about how this is happening in other countries. Fees and taxes, national budget, and I think that's what we sort of discussed in the beginning, that there's maybe too much being paid for through national budgets at the moment. That maybe that responsibility should be shifted. Donor funding as well. Different ways of sort of like operationalizing the polluter pays principle. Levy on chemical manufacturers. Fees. Import fees, exactly. Super interesting.
I assume you can also see the poll in the middle of the screen and the responses that are coming through there as well. We'll scroll them for you so that you can see them.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, exactly. Super interesting. I think, kind of echoing what you brought up in the beginning, Andrea, that there's lots of people saying that it's still through government allocation and government budgets, which is the question that, Ule was also raising, the responsibility, how to shift it, but also knowing that at least what we found, that there's limits to how much can be shifted usually. Fines, it seems like there's a lot of penalties, people sort of suggesting that as well, which is very interesting. Be interested to know what kind of penalties, like for what sort of things. Ring fencing, very interesting. Collaboration, taxes, use container management, very important, also something that for EPRs. Linking biodiversity loss to chemicals, very interesting. Again, making these connections and maybe mainstreaming chemicals financing through with other environmental areas. And there we are. Yes, sorry, Andrea, I'm just seeing your comment here about penalties. Yes, so what we were sort of like more narrowly looking at is really financing, for these government agencies for these oversight activities. So while penalties can absolutely help with cleanups and container management, that's not funding those kinds of sort of like more operational activities wasn't what we were after. But you're absolutely right, they can, and I think often do, but for the more government level financing, so that it doesn't all come from the national budget, how those resources can be recovered. Penalties are often less suitable.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Sorry, I'm jumping in. Just, I do think penalties can play a role. The problem is, in most of our countries, they're a bit of a joke. So, they don't work as being a deterrent. Just to say, we have our last poll for this round. What are good or successful examples of domestic sustainable financing for institutions? in your country? And then I hand back to you. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I think this is the question I'm maybe most excited about, good or successful examples for how particularly those institutions are financed. Yeah, taxes, levies on imported chemicals. Very interesting. Also interesting comment here in the chat about sort of like long-term base financing, about a fund needing to be set up that's fed sort of like by taxes linked to the services sort of provided by the government agency. Very interesting. And yeah, again, something we looked at, that these funds can be an option, especially to ensure funding over time and sort of make most of the financial resources that are collected, but also very much requires expertise and resources to manage and ensure that that does actually work out in the long term. APR systems coming up, carbon tax revenue, very interesting. Something else we looked at, sort of if we can apply models from carbon taxes and other green taxes to this sort of like chemicals area. Very interesting. UNEP, a lot of funding there from donors, fees in Malawi, services imposed on chemicals companies, very interesting. EPR schemes, also very interesting. Ule, I'm seeing your comment here in the chat about penalties and fines. I think interesting. They're very important for prevention, but as we said, as we sort of found, they don't raise such sustainable long-term financial resources. It can be very, very volatile and vulnerable to change. And
so Annika, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yes, I was just very interested from this comment here about Burkina Faso, that they've established this fund. Would love to know, that it's financed through a combination of government contributions, environmental taxes, and fees collected from industries. Very interesting. Would love to learn more about that. That seems like a really good way to set it up. But yes, Andrea, sorry, you were saying.
No, it's Nafisa from Burkina Faso. Perhaps you have a link that you could put in the chat if there's some more information about this scheme. That would be most useful. You've generated a lot of thought and comments, so that's always a good sign. And we do have a digest that comes out at the end where we will summarize the comments that people have made. But I wonder, before we hand over to Rico, if you want to make any concluding points.
First of all, thank you everyone for putting up in all your thoughts. I will be following up on a lot of the things you've put out here. I think keeping these things in mind, and I think coming back to what Ule said, that there's the responsibility question of who's responsible for what and what we need financial resources for, but also thinking about the different types of activities that need to be financed, and that more practical activities of waste and chemicals management might need other systems of financing to sort of more managerial government level kind of activities that are less closely related to the actual activities of management. Thank you so much, and exciting to hear the next speaker present.
Thank you very much, Annika, for your time and sharing the research with us. And I think it's really important because at the moment, I think there's a tendency in low and middle income countries to lean heavily on external funding. And although external funding has a role, I think domestic financing is very important, but how to unpick it and how to make it sustainable. So we're going to move on to our third speaker, Rico. Thank you again for taking time to be with us. I'm going to let you introduce yourself and take us through question 3. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thanks to the other two speakers, because a lot of what I have to say kind of follows on from what they've been saying and speaks to what are the next kind of steps, what are practical steps that we can be thinking about, especially in low middle income countries. So good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining us today. What I'm going to share with you is a case study that is, although not strictly about domestic financing, it still has relevance with regard to this topic, because without these kinds of structures, safe management of chemicals is not possible, I don't think. So what we are talking about more specifically is the social capital in the shape of a multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral national coordination body that is required for this good coordination in order to give meaning and effect to safe chemicals and waste management. And in South Africa, our multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder committee for chemicals management is something that's been in existence now for a long time, since 2007. And it was constituted following the first iteration of our national chemicals profile, which sought to map out the extent of chemicals manufacture, the use and the distribution and trade in South Africa, and what were the legislative requirements for that compliance and oversight. And what followed is probably typical of many situations in many other countries around the world. And that is to say that the responsibility for safe chemicals management is distributed across many, many different government ministries and across many different pieces of national legislation that these ministries are responsible for. And that unless good measures for good coordination are in place, this idea of safe management of chemicals and waste is not possible. And in a sense, this kind of financing, this kind of coordination can come in a soft form. It can come through social capital. It can come through contributions, small contributions from lots of different ministries, acknowledging that they have a role to play in safe chemicals and waste management. It can come from small contributions from different stakeholders, whether they be civil society, NGO stakeholders. We have some examples from Kenya and Ethiopia, and also in Cote d'Ivoire, where civil society themselves have taken the initiative in order to constitute and get these multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder forums for chemicals management started. And it comes in the form of social capital. It comes in the form of people giving their time and showing their dedication to something that they believe that they are responsible for, but also something that they strongly believe in. So another very strong motivation for this is that, in South Africa, our constitution requires that government agencies have to fulfill this mandate, that people have the right to an environment that's not harmful to their health and well-being. So this kind of overarching legislative requirement also places a burden of responsibility across all of these government ministries. So what is the function and the role of our multi-stakeholder committee for chemicals management in South Africa? And it's kind of consolidated over the years. We've consolidated this in a pledge that we make to each other, a responsibility that we make to each other. And we have a terms of reference, almost like a mini constitution. And we've kind of landed at the space where we acknowledge that what we are trying to do as a collective is to facilitate a cooperative approach to discuss the concerns and emerging issues relating to the implementation of safe and sound chemical management practices. And what we want to do is to promote sustainable development, to, however we interpret that. Also to think a little bit about product stewardship throughout the value chains of chemical life cycles, through coordinating between government ministries, as is mandated by their respective legislation, and to, as a collective of government agencies, civil society, industry bodies to think a little bit about our chemicals management policies, our responsibilities in terms of the multilateral environmental agreements, in terms of the legislative and regulatory frameworks that we have, in terms of determining priorities and thinking a little bit about how, as a collective, we work together to address this issue. And that is its fundamental premise. That is what we do. We come together every quarter. We have a work plan. In that work plan, we define the issues that we think are important, whether they are DDT spraying for malaria control, which falls, within the mandate of the National Department of Health, but also has a cross-cutting responsibility to the Department of Fisheries and Forestry and Environment, because they are responsible for the Stockholm Convention and the designated national authority. In terms of that, they have to balance what are their obligations in terms of Stockholm against the obligations of the National Department of Health to control malaria through vector management, etc. And then we have civil society, academics like Andrea, civil society organizations like my own, and also others like Responsible Container Management participating in that forum, and all of us having some kind of say in terms of addressing the problem and thinking about the problem, bringing together the various puzzle pieces of how we experience, the problem. So, for example, academia might say that, through the work that they've been doing, they've been picking up residues of DDT in the environment, in humans, in human biological samples, and this is a problem. And that's weighed against the scale of the problem and how to think about that particular problem along its full life cycle. Bearing in mind that the Stockholm Convention will ban the sale, use, and distribution of DDT by 2025. So our National Department of Health and many others in Africa, in Uganda, and in Tanzania, where DDT might still be used, have to begin to thinking about a different way of addressing their malaria problem through integrated pest management example. Another good example of the operation of our multi-stakeholder Committee for Chemicals Management is through understanding the use of highly hazardous pesticides in our country, bringing to the fore the extent of the problem, bringing to the fore the double standards that exist across the world, that they are banned in the jurisdictions where they are manufactured, but still sold to other jurisdictions around the world, that our chemicals register and registrar should have an ongoing process to continually review the licensing for these highly hazardous pesticides, that our poisons units and the poisons unit participates in this forum, that they have an emerging picture of what its impacts are on human health, and how they are recording human poisonings and bringing that information to the fore. So the benefit, the fundamental benefit of this is that it's cheap, it's very easy to put in place, as long as everybody has a sense of what their responsibilities are and some stakeholders take the lead. It involves social capital. You invest your time and energy in it. In the past, it used to be a face-to-face meeting, but now it can be online. And it can also help us to think very strategically about how we can think about chemicals management in an integrated way, that might also bring in elements of sustainable financing, as Andrea has just posted. And I'll leave it at that, and introduce the first question following this. Thank you.
Thank you, Rico. Thanks very much. And, you know, one of the questions I was thinking about while you were presenting on the multi-stakeholder committee in South Africa was the financing of it. And also that it's, you know, if it was a statutory body, it would have a little bit more strength. And if it had financing, it could actually do some of the research and look into the issues that are brought to the table at the meetings. So thank you. I'll hand over to you to take us to question 3.
Thank you. And that idea of having a standalone agency for chemicals and waste management is something that I've seen repeatedly in the chat thread and in also some of the comments. So perhaps a logical precursor for that kind of agency can be the establishment of these multi-stakeholder forums in countries. So this is the question. What examples of national multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral committees that manage chemicals are there in your country? Can you provide us with some details of who sits on the committee, what their responsibilities are? And also, if you could include your country in your response, that would be very helpful. Needless to say, the idea of a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder approach is fundamentally embedded in the premise of safe chemicals and waste management. And if you look at the very first agreement for global chemicals management, the Dubai Declaration, and in the Global Plan of Action, that idea is embedded within that document, that unless you have multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral approaches to chemicals management, where everybody has a responsibility, it is very, very difficult to achieve safe chemicals management.
Thanks, Rico. So there is some discussion going on in the chat already. If you want to jump in and have a look at that, I ask people to continue to post their questions. As you will note, you are welcome to post in French. We do have Jen in the background who's kindly translating. And also, please post any comments or questions you had for Rico. Thanks.
So looking at some of the comments regarding highly hazardous pesticides and the alternatives and availability of information, one such way that you could bring that information to the fore is through having these voices, these alternative voices, so that it's not just your chemicals management structures are not just dominated by the vendors of chemicals. So, for example, in South Africa, CropLife, as an institution, does participate in our committee, and they do have a strong voice and a strong vested interest. But at least by having different voices in that committee, you can counter that. You can counter the idea that you have to have pesticides to ensure food security and food sustainability. And in fact, if anything is true, it's the opposite, the idea that you need more pesticides to ensure more food security and to grow more food. In the African region, if you map the use of pesticides, there is more and more pesticide use in the region, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's related to less hunger, which is a good measure of more food where it's needed. So even though we have much more pesticide use in the African region, we still have this trend of more hunger, and that is a very objective measure of that.
So just to bring to everyone's attention, we have the first poll for this question. Again, the link to Mentimeter is in the chat, and you can see people are already responding to it. Over to you.
Thank you. So in the chat box, I'm seeing this kind of trend that it seems very sectoral specific. So the Department of Agriculture and the kind of related industries or the related government agencies tend to have coordination. But there are alternatives, and in Zimbabwe, we have an idea of a National Environmental Council, and in that council, there are various ministries, academia, civil society, and business. I would encourage you to introduce the idea of safe chemicals and waste management as a topic, maybe as a subcommittee, and maybe that can be a precursor to a good coordination structure in Zimbabwe. In Malawi, there are several committees housed in different ministries. The idea, Young, is that you should have a structure that transcends across all of the ministries on a single issue. You don't want to have several different committees working on issues in isolation. You want to kind of transcend across all of the government ministries. The idea of a pesticides board, EPA, Customs and Trade Administration, Geology and Mines, that's good. That's a fantastic start. That's some information coming out of Guyana. But I would encourage that you also think about your health ministry and the poisons units, and also your Department of Trade and Industry. If they can get involved, I think those are good segues into thinking about financing, thinking about revenue generation, for example, etc. In Senegal, it seems that you have a National Commission for Chemicals, which is multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary, and that's an interface between the states and grassroots communities. That's good news coming out of that. In Tanzania, also kind of seems to be sector specific with industry, but I would also encourage you to think beyond that. Who decides to sit on the committee? And if you're interested, how do you join the committee? Well, the committee is established, and any emerging issue, anything that is of national interest, of national concern, has a place and a voice at the committee. The committee has a chair. At the moment, it's chaired by our Department of Fisheries and Environment. We can facilitate an introduction to the chair and to justify why the issue and the representation should participate. And I think it shouldn't be a difficult ask. It should be quite an easy ask. Funding is always going to be a problem. However, social capital, and if all the ministries themselves can build into their own budgets small amounts of money so that you can have a coordination structure, so that you can find a coordination, a good way that works for everybody, I think it's a low-hanging fruit, and I think there's definitely a lot of merit in thinking about it.
So we've posted, oh, sorry, Rico, we've posted the last poll for people to comment on, but we can go back to the previous poll when you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I think in the last poll, there's an interesting comment about competing interests. In South Africa, to begin with, the Department of Trade and Industry and the Department of Environmental Affairs were co-leads of this process. And there seemed to be a small tension because the Trade and Industry and their associated kind of ministry felt that they were senior in this regard. But as the stakeholder committee evolved to address fundamental problems of chemicals related to environment, to health, to to safety, to stewardship, it became much easier for DTI to play a secondary role. So they participate. However, the lead is now with the Environment Ministry. You are always going to have these tensions across ministries, and unless we are able to deal with these tensions and have a way of resolving those tensions, I think it's something that we have to work to resolve for safe chemicals and waste management. Fragmentation is an issue because fragmentation cuts across legislation. So where there are different legislative responsibilities, you will always have fragmentation, but at least in a multi-stakeholder forum, people can see how they fit in to that puzzle piece, and they can understand their responsibilities. Interesting comment from Kemi that there has to be a lead, and Kemi leads a toxicology advisory board, and then their task is to identify, what it seems like problem substances of concern, emerging issues of concern, and then maybe that gets delegated on. I think that's an interesting kind of structure. But there's a lot of there are a lot of questions that speak to fragmentation, that speak to different roles and responsibilities, that speak to competition and tension. The only way that we can resolve that is by working together, and by having a collective approach to chemicals and waste management. So I think that would be my take-home message is, I encourage you to think about this in your own countries. I encourage you to think about who is active. Start with those. Think about what are the issues that have traction, whether it's pesticides, whether it's water pollution, water contamination, whether it's agriculture or forestry. Begin there and think about how coordination can begin. Think a little bit about how cooperation happens. And think about what is your own personal role. What do you bring to safe chemicals and waste management in that kind of context? And I think that is a really good basis on which to start and to begin to think how to do this work in a cooperative and a collective way. Andrea, over to you.
Thank you. So I see we still have 5 minutes left. And so I'm just going to ask the other two presenters, Ule and Annika, if you want to comment on anything that has been discussed so far. As the discussion moved along, perhaps it made you think of other things. So Ule, is there anything else you want to add to?
Well, I wrote this comment about our own multi-stakeholder committee, the Toxicology Advisory Board. I've had experience from several countries. One is Thailand. I think they've had a very good arrangement between concerned ministries. And then again, I saw that there was a clear lead in that. In their case, they had decided that the Ministry of Health would lead this chemical cross-cutting committee. But I think then with a clear mandate from the government, and I mean then just not one ministry, from the government to create this, I think it can really work and be very useful.
Thanks. And Annika, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was more thinking on some of the other research we've been doing, which is a bit more general and not so specific to chemicals, but around these sort of like multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral structures that we set up. And I think really echoing what Ule said there about sort of like organizational structures in a way, and how they can be barriers, but also enablers, having a clear lead, and how that leadership might need to be changing over time, that you might need sort of like an entrepreneurial push from some stakeholder in the beginning, and then that needs to shift into something that's more sustained in the long term. That it's about, you know, getting people on board and squaring wins and losses, getting buy-in from people despite the fact that there's conflicts of interest, and crucially how those get resolved. Like, what are the processes for resolving these issues? So yeah, super interesting discussion there in the chemicals context. Thank you. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you. I think one of the things that's really come out for me that's important is when we go back to what the beginning of this discussion was, looking at sustainable financing, so domestic financing. And I think one of the things is it's a daunting task, and often it's because legislation is fragmented in countries. So you've got health doing some chemicals, you've got environment doing some chemicals, you've got agriculture doing some chemicals. And then how is each one supposed to do their own process for domestic financing? And I think what Rico was presenting now with these multi-stakeholder committees, that perhaps there's an opportunity there for, as a collective, to brainstorm together how to actually do more constructive sustainable financing. And the industry is sitting as well on these committees. So I think this is sort of a challenge to us, Rico, that we perhaps need to think about bringing it to our committee as well. So we have 2 minutes left. Rico, do you wanted to make another comment?
Yeah, I've just been scrolling through the chat just quickly and looking at what some of the comments are. And one of the comments that jumped out at me is, you know, that in many African countries, we have projects. We get financing to do a project. So it might be a project to inventory PCBs or to collect PCBs. And that, again, is an entry point. You know, it gives you a kind of hook to think a little bit about how, as a collective, in the context of the project, you can establish these committees and then think beyond the project, the longevity of the committee beyond the project. I think those are really nice opportunities. So whatever projects you might have in your countries, to think of them beyond the project and beyond just the financing for that project, so that there is a degree of a collective responsibility defined, and also a degree of a collective commitment to think a little bit about long-term chemicals and waste management in your countries. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rico, for those last thoughts. Natasha, we can see your Zoom screen there. Thank you. So we've come to the end of this very vibrant discussion. And really, I think this is what we're trying to do with these communities of practice, is to give an opportunity for a broad sector of stakeholders to be able to bring some issues to the table and to discuss it. So I'd like to really thank the 3 speakers, Ule, Annika, and Rico, for your time that you've put into this discussion, and also for spending the time now and engaging with the many members. I'd like to thank the participants. You've been very active. You've presented lots of issues and comments and examples, and we appreciate that. As I said, there will be a digest where we will summarize the discussion today. Make sure that you have signed up for our network. The link is in the chat, and you will then receive the digest. I'd like to thank my team, Natasha and Jen and Caitlin and Maxine, who were all in the background, but particularly Natasha, who was leading on the technical side, particularly when I didn't have sustainable internet, never mind sustainable financing. So thank you, and thank you for bearing with that. Our next discussion will be on the 28th of March, where we now move into chemicals and plastics, and hopefully we'll bring in some of the issues about domestic financing when we look specifically now at the issues. Please do make an effort to download the policy brief that we developed on sustainable domestic financing, which was funded through Sweden and Chemi, and also many of the presenters today were involved in developing that policy brief. Thank you again to all of you, and I wish you a good day or evening or morning wherever you are, and we'll see you on the 28th of March. Bye for now. Shame.
Bye-bye.
Poor you, Ule.
I'll survive.
Well, that's the main thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Till
Bye-bye.
next time.